There are some journeys in life that begin quietly, almost unnoticed, yet lead to the most extraordinary destinations. Among the grand halls of Downton Abbey, filled with titles, wealth, and tradition, one man's story stood apart. He was not a lord nor a master of the house. He was Mr. Molesley, a man often overlooked, sometimes laughed at, and rarely taken seriously. But behind his nervous smiles and awkward stumbles, there lived a quiet strength and an untapped gift. A gift that would one day take him from the servants' hall to a place of honor he had never imagined for himself. That Mr. Molesley's journey had never been easy. For years, he served others with diligence, polishing shoes, carrying trays, and answering bells, always on the edge of fading into the background. He was loyal, but luck seemed to avoid him. Time and again, he found himself misplaced in the great wheel of change at Downton Abbey. When one master moved on, Molesley was left uncertain. When the roles in service grew fewer, he was left to wonder if his place had any real meaning at all. To some, he seemed a man drifting without direction, living not by choice, but by chance. And yet, beneath his quiet exterior, Molesley carried a heart full of kindness and a mind sharper than many realized. His compassion was steady, his patience endless. Though he lacked confidence, he never lacked sincerity. It was this quiet, steady presence that often went unnoticed in a world where louder voices and grander titles ruled the day. But in small moments, when someone needed help, Molesley was there. He was never the hero of the room, never the man in command, but always the one who stayed, listened, and offered what he could. As the years passed, Downton Abbey itself began to change. The old ways of service, once firm and unquestionable, were fading into memory. The great house no longer needed the same army of hands and feet to keep it running. Many servants moved on, seeking new roles in a world no longer ruled by aristocracy. For Molesley, the shift was frightening. His life had always been tied to service, and he could not imagine a future beyond it. He clung to what little certainty he could, though deep down he knew the world was asking him to change as well. It was during these uncertain days that a new path began to open before him, though at first it seemed small and ordinary. Daisy, the young kitchen maid with big dreams and a restless spirit, was eager to learn. She wanted knowledge, a chance to rise beyond her station, and Molesley, in his quiet way, stepped in to help her. At first, it was nothing more than guiding her through a few lessons, helping her make sense of books and numbers. He did not think of himself as a teacher. He thought only of helping a friend. Yet, in those moments, something within him began to stir. Teaching Daisy awakened a side of Molesley that had long been hidden. He discovered joy in explaining, pride in seeing her understand, and a sense of purpose in guiding her forward. The more he helped, the more alive he felt. What had once seemed like a life without direction now revealed a new possibility. Though the walls of Downton Abbey had once defined him, the classroom, even in its simplest form, gave him something the grand house never had the chance to shape a future, not just serve it. The days spent guiding Daisy seemed small to others, but for Molesley, they became the brightest moments in his life. When he sat across from her with an open book, he forgot his doubts, his failures, and the awkward shadow that had always followed him. He spoke with clarity and patience, and Daisy, though often stubborn, listened. Each time she grasped a new idea, Molesley felt as though a door was opening not just for her, but for him as well. For the first time, he was not the one fumbling to keep up, not the man others overlooked. In Daisy's eyes, he was someone to trust, someone with answers, someone who mattered. As he continued to teach her, the change within him grew stronger. His shoulders, once hunched with hesitation, began to straighten. His words, once uncertain, carried a steady confidence. He had stumbled so often in life, but here, in the role of a guide, he walked with sure steps. It was as though a hidden part of himself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the chance to be seen. The more Daisy learned, the more he realized how deeply he cared about helping others find their way. But Molesley's gift was not hidden from everyone. Those around him began to notice the other servants who once teased him for his awkwardness saw a different side of him when he spoke about books and ideas. Even Daisy, sharp-tongued and quick to challenge anyone, softened when she spoke of him. She admitted, perhaps without meaning to, that without his help, she would not have gained the courage to continue her studies. This was the first time in his life that others began to see him as something more than a servant. Still, Molesley was cautious. His past had taught him that good fortune rarely stayed long in his hands. He had lost positions before, faced disappointments, and been left behind while others moved forward. Could he really step into a role beyond service? Could a man who had spent so many years carrying trays and polishing shoes dare to imagine himself as a teacher? These questions haunted him, yet deep inside, hope was beginning to push against fear. The turning point came when his quiet ability reached the ears of those outside the servants' hall. A local school was in need of help, and Molesley, though hesitant, was asked to step in. At first, the idea seemed absurd. He pictured himself standing before rows of children, their young faces waiting for knowledge, and his old fears rushed back. What if he failed them? What if he was not enough? But despite his doubts, he agreed. Something within him whispered that this was not a chance to be wasted. The first day he entered the classroom was unlike any other moment in his life. The walls smelled of chalk and ink, the desks worn from the touch of countless hands, and the air filled with the restless energy of children who wanted to be anywhere but there. As he stood before them, his heart raced, and for a moment, he felt the weight of every failure he had ever known pressing down upon him. But then, something remarkable happened. When he spoke, they listened. When he explained, they understood. The fear that had gripped him slowly gave way to a calm he had never felt before. Each lesson became a bridge, connecting his own struggles with the hopes of the children before him. He knew what it was like to doubt oneself, to feel small in a world that seemed too big, and because of that, he knew how to reach them. His teaching was not just about facts or figures, it was about lifting others in ways he had once longed to be lifted himself. The children responded not because he was perfect, but because he was human, and in his humanity, he gave them something real. This new chapter of his life gave Molesley something he had never truly known: dignity. Not the kind handed down by titles or wealth, but the kind earned by purpose. For years, he had been a man in the background, defined by the needs of others. But in the classroom, he found a space where his voice mattered, where his presence shaped the future, where he could finally stand without fear of being forgotten. It was as though every misstep, every disappointment, had led him to this moment of clarity. And so, in the quiet corner of a classroom, far from the grandeur of Downton Abbey, Mr. Molesley began to rise. He was no longer just the awkward servant, no longer the man uncertain of his worth. He was a teacher, and in that role, he discovered not only his talent but also the truest version of himself. His journey had begun with small steps, but it was carrying him towards something far greater than he had ever imagined. Word of Molesley's gift did not stay hidden for long. What began as quiet tutoring for Daisy and hesitant lessons in a local classroom slowly reached the ears of those who mattered. At first, it was whispered with surprise, "Molesley, the servant, is teaching." To many, it sounded impossible. How could a man who had once stumbled through the routines of service now stand in front of a class and command attention? But when people saw it with their own eyes, the surprise turned to admiration. For the first time in his life, Mr. Molesley was not the object of pity or laughter. He was respected. Respect was something he had longed for but never dared to expect. As a servant, he had always been polite, always careful, always trying to do what was right, yet so often overlooked. The grand families made their decisions, the lords and ladies carried their weight of power, and Molesley stood quietly at the edge, his hands folded, his voice rarely heard. Now, in the schoolroom, things were different. When he spoke, others listened. When he explained, children's eyes lit up with understanding. It was a kind of authority he had never known, not one of power, but of influence, the kind that reached hearts as much as minds. This recognition filled him with emotions he struggled to contain. He had always believed himself ordinary, destined to remain in the shadow of grander lives. But as parents thanked him, as fellow teachers nodded in approval, he realized that he had finally stepped into a role where his value was undeniable. And it was not because of who he served, but because of who he was. This was a revelation that shook him to his core. He no longer needed to be tied to the fortunes of others. For once, he stood on his own merit. The moment that sealed this truth came in a simple but powerful way. During one of his lessons, he asked a question, and to his astonishment, the entire room of children raised their hands eagerly. Their faces were alive with curiosity, their voices bursting to answer, their excitement tangible. In that instant, he felt a swell of pride unlike anything he had ever known. For years, he had carried trays to people who barely looked at him. Now, these young minds looked to him for guidance, for knowledge, for inspiration. It was more than respect, it was trust. And it wasn't just the children who saw him differently. Even those at Downton Abbey, who had known him in his most uncertain years, began to speak of him with warmth and admiration. Lady Grantham, ever observant, remarked on how he had found his place at last. The servants who had once teased him now carried a quiet pride when they spoke of his work. For Molesley, who had lived so long under the weight of self-doubt, this recognition was almost overwhelming. It was as though the world had been holding a mirror to him for years, showing only his flaws, and suddenly that mirror reflected his strength. But with recognition came responsibility. Teaching was no longer a quiet favor, no longer a small act of kindness. It had become his calling. And Molesley, who once doubted every step he took, now had to walk forward with certainty. The children depended on him, their futures shaped by the lessons he gave. He realized that this role was not just about knowledge, but about example. He was showing them that even a man who had stumbled through life could find his place. In his presence, they saw not just a teacher, but a story of perseverance, of transformation, of hope. In many ways, Molesley's recognition was not just about him. It was about everyone who had ever felt small, everyone who had ever been told they were less than they could be. His journey became a quiet symbol that no matter how late in life it may come, purpose can still be found. And that purpose, once discovered, can give more dignity and joy than any title, wealth, or position ever could. Standing in front of his students, chalk in hand, Molesley finally understood something that had eluded him for years. Life had not been cruel in keeping him waiting. Every failure, every misstep, every long year of uncertainty had prepared him for this. He knew what it meant to doubt, and so he could guide others through their doubts. He knew what it meant to feel unimportant, and so he could remind others of their worth. In every struggle of his past, he found the strength to shape the future, and so recognition was not just about applause or approval, it was about belonging. For the first time, Mr. Molesley belonged not because he fit into someone else's world, but because he had built his own. His classroom became his kingdom, not of wealth or power, but of ideas and dreams, and in that kingdom he reigned with humility, patience, and the quiet courage that had always been within him, waiting to be seen. There is a quiet kind of triumph that does not need applause or grandeur to be felt. It is the triumph of a man who has struggled, who has stumbled, who has been overlooked, and yet, through patience and perseverance, has finally discovered his purpose. For Mr. Molesley, that triumph was not found in the great halls of Downton Abbey, nor in the approval of lords and ladies. It was found in the simple wooden desks of a classroom, in the eager eyes of children, and in the realization that he had something worth giving to the world. The beauty of Molesley's journey lies not in its perfection, but in its imperfection. He was never the most confident, never the most polished, never the man people expected to succeed. His story was filled with moments of awkwardness, doubt, and disappointment. And yet, those very struggles shaped him into the teacher he became. Because he knew what it was like to feel uncertain, he could comfort others in their uncertainty. Because he had been underestimated, he knew the power of encouraging someone who doubted themselves. His weaknesses, once the source of his shame, became the roots of his greatest strength. What makes his story so moving is the timing. Many people imagine that purpose must come early, that success belongs to the young, that those who do not find their path quickly may never find it at all. But Molesley's life stands as proof that it is never too late. In the later years of his life, when others might have resigned themselves to fading quietly into the background, he began a new chapter. His courage to step into something new, despite his fears, is what makes his transformation extraordinary. It is not the story of a man who was destined for greatness, but the story of a man who created greatness by refusing to give up. And perhaps that is why his journey resonates so deeply. We see in him the reflection of our own uncertainties, our own fears of being overlooked, our own doubts about whether we matter. Through Molesley, we are reminded that even in the smallest acts, teaching, guiding, encouraging, there is dignity. True worth is not measured by the titles we carry, the wealth we own, or the recognition we receive, but by the impact we have on others. Molesley, once the servant who blended into the background, became the teacher who lit the way for the next generation. This transformation also echoes the larger theme of Downton Abbey itself, the shifting world, where the rigid lines between classes began to blur. The servants were no longer bound entirely to the fates of the families they served. They were beginning to carve out their own futures. Molesley embodied this change more than anyone. He showed that identity is not fixed, that we are not forever tied to where we began, and that dignity can be found in building something of our own. His story, in many ways, became a quiet rebellion against the old order, proving that even the humblest life could hold extraordinary meaning. In the end, what mattered most was not that Molesley had been a servant, or that he had once lived in the shadows of others, but that he had chosen to rise when life gave him the chance. He did not let fear dictate his future. He did not let the voices of doubt silence him. Instead, he stepped forward, nervous but determined, and found a place where he could truly shine. And in doing so, he became an inspiration not only to those around him, but to everyone who has ever wondered if it was too late to begin again. As we reflect on his journey, we are reminded of a simple truth. Life's greatest purpose often reveals itself in unexpected places, at unexpected times, through unexpected people. Mr. Molesley's path from servant to teacher is not just a story about 1 minute, is a story about resilience, about hope, and about the quiet courage it takes to embrace change. His triumph was not marked by wealth, by glory, or by power. It was marked by the lives he touched, the knowledge he shared, and the dignity he earned by simply being true to himself. And so, when we think of Downton Abbey and all its grand characters, it is worth remembering that sometimes the noblest calling is not found in titles or estates, but in the simple, powerful act of shaping the future. Mr. Molesley, once overlooked, became proof that greatness can be found in the most ordinary of lives. His story closes not with the sound of applause, but with the quiet scratch of chalk against a board, the eager whispers of children ready to learn, and the lasting truth that purpose is never too late to find.